Hello, welcome back to I Got Board Game.
Woo!
I
I
got
got a
board
board game. I got
game.
board game.
I am Ben,
I'm John.
and today this is our part two to our little videos series on IGBG Explains Turn Order. So this is part two. We're in part one. If you want to check that out, it'll be linked in the description below. But in part one, in talking about turn order or the idea of how games keep track of time, pacing, when players get to go, we talked about the terms that games use for that. They use in the rules, people use it when teaching the game, explaining it. We basically provided basic definitions to those key terms that come up a lot, like turn, round, phase, scenario, game. And so all of those hopefully were helpful to make it clear when games are explained this way, hopefully even help you guys when you're learning games or teaching games to others. And then in that part one, we also then ended in providing examples of certain kinds of games, specifically simultaneous play games and real-time games that basically bypass a lot of that timing language and such because they don't require that kind of separated timing because they're playing at the same time or players are playing all in real time in active clock. But now in part two, we're going to talk about different ways that games actually handle determining turn order in a play of the game. And so in talking about this, we're going to be first looking at just a couple examples and the main concept from older games, which is known as set turn order, where basically the order that players play in is very simple and set for the whole game. And then we'll compare that to changing turn order, which is a little more of a modern idea where there's different ways that games try to change up the orders that player get to play in. And so we'll mainly compare those two categories while providing examples to you. But then also in talking about changing turn order, we'll look at maybe a couple older games that started maybe introducing different ways that they can move away from a set turn order to then a lot more modern examples that do it very differently. And so to get started,
Exactly.
John.
We will start off with set turn orders
Yeah.
in this space. Yeah, so I think set turn orders, I think, are pretty simple in concept. These are, as we said, very traditional games that you've probably played or you're probably used to playing in some capacity. When we're talking about set turn orders, basically what it is when you start the game, effectively, once it's started, there's always a sequence of players in the same kind of turn sequence that will always be going after each other. So if like we're talking about a game like Monopoly or the game of life, right? Once the player or the first player is determined, you always start with that first player to start. And then usually what most games do is clockwise order, or the player to your left, right? Who will be the next player to play. So in these kinds of games, it's always that way. You never change it, right? Like the first player in Monopoly is always the first player in that game. Or in the game of life, they're always the one who they started the round or the turns, and then they do their turn, then the next player to their left does their turn, and so on and so forth. And then once it gets back to them, it's considered a new round, but then you continue with that same turn order, right? So other games that are very similar to this is like Sorry, Cranium, Scrabble. All of these games are very basic in terms of those players are always it. It's not like I play and then somehow somebody else gets, a turn that's not the person to my left, right? So that's always the case in those games. Even two-player older games like chess, like backgammon, like checkers are always kind of that set, same player, one after the other in that way.
So yeah, so that's very simple understanding of set turn order in a lot of classic games. And then a small related idea we wanted to mention here, but we won't go into details, just related to turn order. There's also usually rules on how you determine who is that first player. In a lot of older games, I mean, obviously I haven't played them in a long time, but it felt like it would be really random or just kind of, you choose who goes first, and then we'll just start playing.
Mhm.
Where then, there were certain games where people might be more familiar with, like chess. It's always the player playing the white pieces is the first player, right? But then also, I think it's interesting in more modern games than this idea of determining the first player in a game. Uh, some designers have more creative ideas on that. Like I know with Pandemic, it's whoever was most recently sick.
Mhm.
And Sheriff of Nottingham, that bluffing game, it's whoever has the most money in their wallet at that time.
Mhm.
So that's just like a slightly related topic because it has to do with determining the first player. But just wanted to mention that. But we're going to keep going on talking about turn order itself
Mhm.
by going on to talking about changing turn order, as I mentioned.
Like this. Changing turn order.
Dang.
You thought I didn't have a picture.
Yeah, I was wondering where your
But
picture was earlier. But yeah, so for changing turn order, first I mentioned we would, in this kind of category, we would kind of talk about older games that maybe had changing turn order, and then compared to a lot of more modern games that have changing turn order for sure. But when thinking about older games, even in that same time as those classics that John mentioned, there are a couple games that start to change turn order a little bit, like step away a little bit from the whole first player and then clockwise forever, And so one of those cases would be Uno. John mentioned this to me before we started, and I didn't realize, but it's true. If you guys know Uno, there is the reverse card, which reverses it from clockwise to counterclockwise or back to
or you play
clockwise.
another reverse right after, and it just bounces between two people.
But in a way, that is kind of a little bit of what made it that kind of game interesting, right? Mixing it up a bit of, okay, it's not always just clockwise. There could be something that throws it off, then maybe makes the players play a little differently, right? And then another case that is also very classic, but I think maybe mixes it up even more are trick-taking games, right? That category is very traditional, and there are obviously older games played with like a deck of cards that are trick-taking games, like what is it, Hearts and Bridge, to then even modern ones like The Crew, which we have reviewed, and The Fox in the Forest and Indulgence. These are all trick-taking games where in trick-taking games where the general idea is every round you have someone who is the leader who leads, and then everyone else has to follow, most likely in clockwise order. But what happens is whoever wins the trick is the person who starts the next round. So in that case, the turn order doesn't have to be the next clockwise player starting, but whoever won the trick. So it can bounce around depending on who wins the trick.
Would you call a trick that's won a round or a turn?
Around.
It's true, it is a round because
Because then everyone else is
the
still
turn is when you
playing.
play the card itself.
Yeah. And then the next player plays their turn playing a card in clockwise order, probably.
Fair.
But yeah, still in that case, that is another, case of older games where it does change up the turn order, right? Depending on who actually won that trick, won that round. But so those are still looking at small changes from turn order, and now to even more modern games that really kind of do different things with turn order.
Yep.
We have.
We will start off with the first game. Viticulture.
Viticulture. We have reviewed.
Yep. So as you've mentioned before, so even when we were talking about those older styles of changing the turn order, for the most part, when we were saying it, the turn order, while it may have been varied or different in the terms of maybe who's the first person who's playing a card in a trick taking during the trick, or in like Uno where you kind of reverse the turn order, it's always still kind of in a sequential order that's kind of based on the person who's sitting usually to your left or to your right. Right. So it's kind of always following a certain sequence where you're never changing it up that much. But in viticulture, as I'll pull it up again. Yeah, viticulture. It actually does change a little bit different. So viticulture is a little bit, and we reviewed the game before, but it's a little bit different in the way that you do the selection, where at the start of each round, there is a first player token that is passed clockwise around the group of players for however many rounds need to be played in the game. But the interesting thing about viticulture is that the player who is first isn't choosing the actions that they're taking first. What they're choosing is effectively what sequential number within a tracker of like I think 7 numbers that they want to be in. And then based on the positioning of other people's rooster, I believe, if I remember the token correctly, based on the positioning of that rooster, once all players have selected their position, that's when you know the actual turn order for the round itself. So there's kind of almost 2 phases of turns or of selections that players are taking. The first is determining turn order, and then the second is the actual playing of the turns in the game itself, right? And it's very unique and it's very different because that's the concept of the game means that someone who's the first player who is selecting their turn, like their turn spot,
their wake up time
lineup,
right?
Yeah, their wake up time, I believe is what it's called in the game. It doesn't necessarily mean just because they're the first person to place it means that they're going to be the first person placing workers throughout the rest of the round of the game. They could be the last player playing, for the rest of the round. And that could be the same for every other round that plays, depending on how they position their rooster in the wake up time, right? Versus someone who's not the first player and could be the last person to select, could actually be the first player when it's their turn order. And then the other cool thing about it, as we mentioned, is it's not based on your seating positioning to other players. It's based on, again, the tracker of where you're waking up, right? So it definitely throws in a different, unique mechanic to turn order selection and turn order actions in the game, because it also fits in with the theme of the game and the mechanic of the game, which is a worker placement style game where there is a limited number of places that one can put their workers and a limited number of workers that you have. So your turn order in selecting those spots does become an important part of how you play this game. So it's a very unique way of not just changing turn order for the sake of changing turn order, but it actually adds the elements of the game and it fits that kind of concept very well, which if you just played it like a normal set turn game, it would not be a very good game, or like it would require a lot of different ways of trying to balance it, which may not feel like the masterpiece that this game.
yeah it definitely allows them to add, like you're kind of mentioning, the strategies or incentives for people to wake up at different times, right? That becomes another element of the game, which then adds to the strategy of it. And so similar to that, another game that also follows that way of choosing your turn order for the coming round is 5 Tribes. Ooh. And so in 5 Tribes, every round begins with a bidding phase. So it's similar. It's not called a wake up track, but it's still determining your turn order for that whole round. But then players are actually bidding on their turn order. And so depending on where you place your piece, that's how much you're bidding. And then that's how early or late you get to go during that round. And so, yeah, it's similar to basically what you described with viticulture, but it just adds that idea of having to spend money to choose your wake up order. And so it's even similar also in that sense that viticulture's wake up track has those incentives, where then in 5 Tribes, it's not necessarily incentives, but I don't know if the term is disincentive.
It's how much are you willing to invest, right?
Yeah.
If you think about it that way, how much are you willing to invest of your resources to get priority, right?
Yeah.
So because you can spend a lot, but if you spend too much, then other players are just gonna beat you because you put too much money into going first, and it doesn't actually benefit you as much as you thought.
Yeah. So I think the term was de-incentivize you to right, because in viticulture it's like if you go earlier you get less of a benefit, later you probably get a stronger benefit. Where in this one it's like the opposite, right? Where if you want to go earlier, you have to pay a lot more than whoever wants to go later, who can probably go even last if they want for free, right, and save their money. And so that's a one where again you're changing up the turn order for that round, but it's done through bidding and paying for when you go.
Yeah, so then another style and another way of doing changing turn orders, which is different than these two, is in a few different games that we've played, and I think have we reviewed any of these? I don't think we have.
I don't think so.
I don't think
do
so.
have
So
one of them here though.
we have some. So they're basically the way of changing turn orders. Oh, we'll say the names of the games first. So there's a few different games like Twilight Imperium 4,
Which I have,
Mission
but
Red
it's
Planet.
too heavy. Mission Red Planet.
Mission Red Planet. And then I forgot because I have one and I didn't.
Oh yeah.
Here we go. And Citadels.
Yeah.
I think this is the version 1 version. So of Citadel.
Classic version.
So these 3 different games as examples, and there's a number of other games that are very similar or do the same, is the way that the turn orders work are actually tied to these strategy tiles, effectively, that are selected at the beginnings of the rounds that the players are playing. So usually there'll be a first player who has to select or choose, kind of similar to the way that viticulture was. In that sense, but what you do in these games is you actually have a tableau of different numbers of depending on how many different turns there are within the game. So in Citadels, there's I think base game is 1 to 8. I think if you have the expansion, it's 1 to 9 or 1 to 10 numbers. Mission Red Planet I think has up to 8 as well.
I think it might be 9
or 9. It might be 9.
1 through 9.
And then Twilight Imperium, I believe, has 8, if I remember correctly, 8 different selection token sections. So basically, in each of them, what you're doing in that way is you're actually selecting who's going, like, kind of where you are in the turn order just immediately. So in Citadels, if within that sequence of 1 through 8, if I choose number 1 when we start the round, as number 1, I go first immediately. And then in the game Citadels, there's usually powers associated with each of those numbers, where some of the earlier numbers, it is actually guessing other numbers that are coming later because there's a certain benefit to it. And then you do your turn, and then you see if there's a second, if someone chose the second tile, so on and so forth through the turns. So there is a set number of turns, so to speak, within the game, but you're actually choosing as the player what turn you're taking in that game, which is a pretty unique way of doing it. I think in Mission Red Planet, it's very similar, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think in all 3 of these, there is like what motivates you to strategize in your choice is that each number, which is the turn order, has a certain different power associated with it, different character, something. So you kind of have to balance how you're choosing that, right? Like, do I want the earlier turn order with the power, or do I want the later turn order with that power?
Yeah. So that one, it's definitely different because, again, kind of in that idea of incentivized selections, where by choosing those particular ones, you do get benefits and bonuses in it. But then the thing that's unique about them is usually these games, it's like that is your turn that you're doing actions and activities on, versus maybe in like the other games like viticulture, it's just setting kind of the general turns for the whole round. And then
like in viticulture,
turns within that round, but in these games, that is the turn for the round.
Kind of. Yeah, that's true. So, yeah, viticulture is like that's unique. Like your slot to do your turn.
Exactly.
Where in these, it's very much that is the one time that'll happen, and that is the action you're taking, like that power that you actually chose with that number in the sequence. And so another way modern games change turn order, and this is actually a much simpler way of doing it, is games like Patchwork, this 2-player game, and a more recent game, The Search for Planet X. The way these do it is there's kind of a time tracker as players are taking turns, and their actions take up a certain number of times, so that's how many spaces they move along the track. And so then it's the way they determine whose turn it currently is, who is the active player, is whoever is farthest behind on that track, whoever basically spent the least amount of time so far. And so that's basically it. It's very simple to understand. Basically, whoever is in last on time, they get more turns until they actually get ahead on how much time they spend. And so, but that does add an interesting strategy, because then it allows the designers to balance, which actions are more powerful and thus should take up more time versus ones that are weaker and take less time. And so then players can then also play and strategize by saying, if they're going to spend a lot of time, I'm going to do a lot of these small actions that take a little time. So I get a lot of turns to do things until I catch up.
And
But
it's a pretty cool strategy in that way, as you were just saying. It's like it's kind of this thought process of, is it worthwhile to do kind of a big power play that it puts me forward a lot, but it means that I'm taking a lot of time to get this done. And then you're basically sacrificing the fact that now the other player has the options of a lot of different smaller actions and moves that also usually require some kind of a refresh of the board or whatever you're playing with, that gives them more opportunities to see other options. That you do the power play, which is great, and then you see that other tile that you really wanted in like patchwork, or you see something else that might come up in the other game, or like during the other player's turn, you're like, I really wanted to do that, but you sacrificed it because you spent a lot of time to do that other thing, right? So it's that, and that's the part where it's really cool when the designers have been able to implement that into the game.
Yeah, like in the Search for Planet X, which is a deduction game, competitive deduction game, the actions that take more time are the ones that give you more specific information of, say, where certain like not planets but celestial bodies, those kind of objects in space, where they are located, right? You probably can spend a lot of time to find exactly where one is located, or you can spend less time to get more general information. But if you get general information on a lot of different sectors, then you can maybe start even deducing multiple things in those sectors versus just knowing where one thing is. So and so then there's, I think, one more way that we thought of that modern games change.
And so this is kind of a side one as well. This is more of a special rule in certain games and in certain types of games. These typically are more the competitive, combative style games, or games that are more head-to-head of players playing between each other. But we've reviewed some games like Exceed, things like like that one that Ben is showing, BattleCon. I think there's a couple other battle games like Dice Throne and things like that, where because it's kind of this head-to-head fighting, if it was only like the same turn order over and over, where it's always like the same player going first, it'd be kind of boring, or just kind of be like, all right, whoever got first kind of has priority, so this kind of sucks. So the thing that they added into these games is this, typically what I'll use these general phrases of speed and stun, again, because it's usually kind of fighting styled more, but the concept of basically when you're in the middle of a conflict between the other player trying to deal damage or trying to do something, there's kind of two active parts. There's one part that is the activation of your abilities, which what you're playing cards maybe simultaneously after like the action is started of fighting, and then based on the speed of the card will actually activate your card first, right? So while it may be a simultaneous play of the card, it's usually face down, and then you kind of see the resolution, and that kind of determines the resolution of the actions that happen. And then what these games usually have is also something called stun, right? Where if you've been dealt a certain amount of damage that's not blocked or not mitigated by, I think they use stun guard in Exceed and or in BattleCon, then the player who got stunned effectively has to skip the turn, and it's the player who caused the stun gets to have their turn again, right? So you can actually chain multiple turns together if you're able to continuously and successfully either stun the opponent player, right, in some way, or use other action cards that let you kind of get that way. So it's kind of the side special rule where, again, it is a very unique niche of games that is focused on this kind of, you're trying to vie for getting the next turn and trying to make sure that you can kind of always keep going with your cards versus kind of preventing the other player from doing their turn.
Yeah, like in Exceed, you're mentioning stun. Stun would be what actually cancels the other person's card, right? So their card doesn't even activate. And then also there's the term of advantage,
Oh
right?
yes, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, where certain, so yeah, there's the idea of stun canceling out the card. So in a sense, like if you're faster, your card goes first anyway, even though it's simultaneous play, as you said, but then you even cancel out the other person's card. And then certain cards can even give you advantage, where then that's saying you get your next turn instead of the other person.
That just shows I haven't played Exceed enough, so I probably need to play again.
So yeah, but there are those two ideas in Exceed, right, that kind of do that.
Mhm.
And so yeah, and so then I mean, lastly, one thing we do want to mention, another related topic that we won't go into detail about, but it still kind of is related, so we just want to give you an idea of it, is that what there's something that a lot of games nowadays do relating to turn order, is that to keep the game balanced or fair in a sense, they make it so that everyone has the same number of turns, right? Every player gets the same number of turns through the game. Because if you think about it, a lot of those older games that we would think about and might have known from growing up, like Monopoly, Battleship, Sorry, so on, all of those, we mentioned those in talking about set turn order, but then also the game would end whenever one player reached the goal, right? Whether it was a certain amount of money or eliminating everyone else, right? Or just getting to the end line first, then the game would end. Where then in a lot of modern games, and more so now, a lot of designers include the mechanic of having everyone have the same number of turns, so that whatever round you're in, if one player reaches that end goal first, the rest of the players who haven't gone in that round yet will still get their turn. So then in that case, it makes it fair so that everyone has the same number of turns to try to reach that same goal. And then it even includes rules usually of, if that one player triggered the end game first, like the next players could still end up getting more points on their last turns than that first player that reached the end. So those players could still catch up. And so that's kind of how games try to make it fair and balanced now.
Mhm.
But yeah, so that's kind of just a side relating to turn order and what designers also try to implement with it nowadays. But overall, that is our IGBG Explains of turn order, and specifically in this part 2, set turn order versus changing turn order. And
Before we
so,
end, Ben, what's your favorite type of turn order changing game
oh
style?
man, my favorite one. That's hard to say. That's hard to say.
It is
I
kind of
actually do like the last player getting to be the active player. I think that's kind of just a really clean and simple idea to explain. Versus it could seem just a little complicated, maybe just because it's so novel, the turn order where you have to bid for it or such like that, and then it kind of then mixes up players turns jumping around the circle that you're usually sitting in around the table, right? Where I think it's just simpler and easier to see when it's just like whoever's behind on the track, that's the person whose turn it is. And so I think that might be my favorite, at least just in its simplicity. Why? What's yours,
No,
John?
I just wanted to ask because we weren't really asking for our opinions this round. So I was like,
Yeah.
what can I ask you? That's
Do you have a favorite one that you prefer?
I mean, I think I really like the concept of the changing orders. I do feel like viticulture right now, from my perspective, like the selection of the ability of choosing when you want to go in the order with certain incentives involved with it is a very clever way of doing it versus just this kind of, oh, I want to always be first kind of prioritization. Or even in the game, like if you do that, it's like you are sacrificing certain certain activities, so you may not always get what you really want, right? And I think that's a pretty cool way of like giving more agency to players to actually select how they want to go through their turn. It is definitely a lot more complicated. It does add a lot of strategy to something as simple as when you want to go, so it is a little bit more complex and it's not as beginner friendly, let's say. But I do think that it is like a really fun way of making games not just be like, oh, I got kind of screwed by sitting next to this player who ended up rolling better than I did to get first place, or like they had more money in their wallet than I did, so I'm last. So okay, I guess I just have to wait till I become first player like three rounds later, kind of thing, right?
No,
So,
I do agree that, yeah, all of the modern ones we mentioned on changing order are better than better than the older ways, especially set turn order. I think that's just too simple to keep things that way nowadays in board games, right? You can do a lot more, and like in all the examples that we mentioned, introduce another layer of strategy or even just choices for the players when you can kind of introduce this way of changing turn order versus just being really plain set clockwise. Yeah. And so with that, thank you for watching. I hope you found this helpful in talking about turn order. And if it was helpful, I hope you'll share this video with your friends, family, people you play board games with. Hope you'll consider subscribing to this YouTube channel, following us on Instagram at I Got Board Game. And until next time, we will see you then. Bye.
I